The Canby Report was produced and recorded on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam peoples. It is August 20th, 2026, and there are 58 days until the Vancouver municipal election. This is the Canby Report. I'm Ian Bushfield, and joining me today...
Stewart Prest. Happy to be with you one more time.
Welcome back. It's been a while since we've had a guest on Canby Report, and I figured Matthew and I's schedules weren't lining up, but, you have lots of thoughts and opinions and can bring some good analysis to the two topics we're going to discuss today. So it's a pleasure to bring you back.
I'm happy to be back here, and I'm just getting back into the swing of things after a month away. I went back to Alberta to show my family the old country where I'm from. And so it is fitting here to be chatting as the unofficial opening of the Vancouver municipal election when we have a couple of juicy polls to look at.
I will remind everyone to go to patreon.com/Canby Report, support the show, and you will get access to our Slack channel where you can keep up the discussion between the intermittent episodes that have become the format of this show. But hopefully I can get a few more out before the actual vote comes down in under 2 months now. You mentioned Alberta. One of the fun things happening in Alberta that makes political scientists like you, I imagine, shake your head is the series of referendum questions they're having. Vancouver must have been jealous because Ken Sim, kind of out of nowhere, pitched this emergency council meeting to put 2 questions on its own ballot. These are clearly, pressing issues that we had to address.
That's an excellent pivot, and it is really relevant comparison as well. I do think this is something of a trend we're now seeing among right-of-center parties in the country, seeing willingness to go to the polls. And of course, we have historical examples we could look at in BC as well. But this idea of getting people to vote on things that are not really of the convening government's ability to grant it, and therefore a kind of dubious constitutionality. This is a highly performative act here by the city council to put these questions in front of the electorate. I think it's very much about the election going on around the plebiscite, ultimately why the questions are being asked and the way they're being asked in particular.
Yeah, so let's just get right into it. The 2 questions that ABC brought forward and had to call a special council meeting after they had adjourned previous ones saying we don't have any time to deal with more business before the election. They called a special council meeting. The preface to the 2 questions is Vancouver has experienced unprecedented levels of street disorder, open air, hard drug use, and disruption to community safety and individual health. Therefore, yes or no, are you in favor of the City of Vancouver strengthening its laws to forbid open air hard drug, heroin, meth, fentanyl, and crack use in public spaces? 2, should the City of Vancouver formally ask the province of BC to convert portions of the old St. Paul's Hospital or another similar site into a secure medical facility that provides acute voluntary and 100+ involuntary care beds for individuals posing a serious risk for themselves or others due to severe substance use and mental health disorders?
It's a lot. Let's start with the preamble there. Vancouver has experienced unprecedented levels of street disorder, open air, hard drug use, and disruption to community safety and individual health. So they're asserting that. So this is an attempt to shape public perception in the preamble. They're not presenting evidence to support some sort of claim against the long history of Vancouver. They're just saying things are worse than they ever have been. And so clearly something has to be done. That's the implication. Are you in favor of doing something or not? It's a highly charged opening to what is supposedly a neutral testing of public opinion.
Also, Stewart, remind me if I'm wrong, but if this claim is true, who's been in charge for the last 4 years with the majority on council?
Well, this is an excellent point. This is presumably the culmination of 4 years of ABC's attempts to bring about public order. This has been a priority for them since coming to office with their famous commitment to hire 100 cops and 100 public health nurses to deal with the situation. They have taken dramatic action, including the sweep through the downtown east side, displacing unhoused people there into other parts of the city. Those people don't cease to exist when they have been displaced from where they have been congregating. So really drawing attention to presumably the lack of attention to the issue by council over the last 4 years. It's a bold strategy, Cotton, as the meme would have it. And it is also, just to point out, using charged language even in describing the situation, talking about open air hard drug use. Like, that's not exactly a neutral framing. This is trying to drive it home that this is something bad to be worried about. I'm surprised they didn't use more slang terms for drugs, talking about the use of Molly on the streets among the kids and whatnot. Like, it is torqued. It is spun.
They notably don't include cocaine in the list of hard drugs, and we don't need to get into that, but it was noticed by quite a few people online that they talk about heroin, meth, fentanyl, and crack, but like, where's blow?
Right. The problem here is crack cocaine, not cocaine.
The first question is obviously set up that who's against this, right? You can't vote against cracking down on open air hard drug use. Notably, though, when Ken Sim was asked, like, what laws are you looking for? He's dodged the question repeatedly and said, that's a future conversation, or we'll look into that when we get to it. It's absolutely frustrating.
It is, because that is clearly not a future question. This is asking for some kind of a mandate to pass new laws. What new laws are you suggesting would be the natural question people should want to ask and have answered before saying, yes, that's a good law. It's a kind of political performance ultimately, and really, as you say, trying to torque it to say, well, surely you can't be in favor of open air hard drug use. You must be opposed to it. So what person is going to vote against that? And ultimately here, I think the purpose is to reframe the conversation heading into this election season, to get people talking about which party is best positioned to deal with the problem that the preamble is asserting is the preeminent problem. But voters might actually be interested in talking about other things like access to housing, affordability issues, access to public services. There are all kinds of things that the public may want to talk about in the run-up to the election. And this seems like an early move to try to short-circuit some of that conversation.
Well, even integrity and accountability in City Hall. We've gone over on this show a number of stories where Sim has been, frankly, an embarrassment to the city, and something that I think a lot of people have not liked the stories of him building a gym in City Hall or being the Bitcoin mayor.
Right.
As a podcast host, we should not be mayors of cities.
What?
I'm just saying.
This is true as long as we're in these chairs and not those chairs. A recurring issue of trying to frame and focus and narrow the conversation. It is a challenge to get voters to really focus in on issues of accountability and integrity. Code of conduct issues can become secondary during the election when people are really focused on bottom line kinds of issues. But the fact that the mayor and the majority have been in conflict with the integrity commissioner of the city on numerous fronts really is something that people should pay attention to. It should be one of the issues that we talk about.
The second question here then is really fascinating. Has been on a kick recently trying to argue the province has no interest or has not been willing to put involuntary care beds in the city of Vancouver. And so here, I think, is his attempt to try to say, hey, we have this building, put them there, dismissing a few relevant facts, like, as far as I know, the site has already been sold.
Hey.
So it would require being bought back by the province. The other angle that I find fascinating to this claim, if anyone had pitched opening something like an involuntary care facility or a new prison, which is how it kind of works as a prison hospital, the NIMBYs would be out in force. I believe that strongly. Build a prison in your neighborhood is classic. No one wants that.
Right.
They want it to exist, but not in their backyard, which is why they're building them in Maple Ridge and Surrey, them there in existing facilities. And so it's a weird twist where Sim is attempting to, I think, try to put his money where his mouth is, that, we need to be strong and take action on this, and we're willing to do it. But actually putting a location in is fascinating politics to me.
Yeah, it is curious. There is clearly, as with the first question, an attempt to try to frame this issue and to give the council the ability to say, look, we are on the forefront of this issue. Those who are worried about public order, who are worried about the instances of mental health challenges in Vancouver and the unmet need for care for those who are perhaps unwilling to seek it for various reasons on their own. This is an issue that's floated around the last provincial election. It's not a new issue. And it's a challenging one because it gets at the confluence of concerns regarding public safety, public health, but also the personal integrity and rights of individuals to consent to care or not, to have the right to consent. That's one concern. And it does rise to the level of constitutional challenge. You can't just wish that away. So that's one concern. And there may be some instances where the concerns of community safety do have to trump individual rights, but we never want to default to that. We want to make sure that those decisions are very carefully taken. It's not a blanket solution. And there is a real risk here that what we're moving towards is a kind of recreation of the failed solutions of the past. I think to look at this, in some ways, it sounds like the mayor and council are proposing to rebuild something like Riverview Hospital in downtown Vancouver. We want to have a dedicated involuntary care facility for issues of mental health where people are dealing with these challenges in an institutionalized setting where they do not feel like they're making the choice to enter freely. We know that that doesn't work. Quite often leads to more harm than good. There are budgetary reasons, but there are also important reasons of care why that Riverview model is not one that we continue to pursue. People, when they feel institutionalized, when they feel like they don't have choice, will not respond well to care. So we need to find other models. And there is clearly an unmet need. There is a need for more funding and for creative solution, but this is not a creative solution. This is a throwback. And it is a strong signal to anyone who wants to hear it that this is a government of law and order ultimately and public safety, no matter the cost. That's the signal that ultimately comes out of this plebiscite. Again, it's a highly torqued language.
Well, and the other thing, to keep coming back to this idea that this is purely about turnout and driving the election, is Vancouver has had a number of plebiscites over the years. The most recent one was 2004, when there was a vote on going to a ward system over at large. In 2003, there was a plebiscite on hosting the Winter Olympics. In 2015, there was the Metro Vancouver mail-in ballot on the transit referendum about moving to a regional sales tax to fund transit. That was rejected. In the 90s, there was a vote on keeping the zoo at Stanley Park. And I actually just found in 1981, there was a plebiscite on Sunday shopping and whether that should be allowed before the Big M Drug Mart case ultimately knocked down those laws for the most part. But what's notable about every one of those cases, as far as I know, is none of them were held in conjunction with the local election. Each of those councils made the decision that these were important enough questions to go to the voters, and I think in each of these cases you can make a decent argument that there is a value in it. We can have a long debate about the value of referendums and that kind of approach to policymaking, but at least on these I can see what the argument is, whether I buy it or not. And then by separating it from an election, it just becomes a question about that rather than the question about whether you like current council and that vote. Now, the HST referendum provincially, I think, ultimately became a vote on Gordon Campbell.
Right.
But at least by not having it with an election in all those other cases, it wasn't just for their own political advantage.
Right. I tend to use the metaphor of the sorcerer's apprentice whenever we're talking about referenda, because what you're trying to do is generate a legitimate outcome on a charged and presumably important political question. So they tend to make the most sense when the question is foundational, something about the nature of the political community. So referendum on, say, a new constitution seems like a justifiable use of referendum. But as soon as you go to the people saying, we want you to vote, you are a strong signal of legitimation or delegitimation, right? So once the people vote, the bell that has rung, that can't be unrung. It can lead to all kinds of unforeseen and regrettable consequences, as many in the UK will continue to tell you regarding the outcome of the Brexit referendum. Once the people speak, you have to take what they say into account. A referendum like this, where it is really trying to put the city at odds with the provincial government, let's say, or trying to put the city at odds with constitutional rights of individuals, that's not a healthy place to be sending strong democratic signals of legitimation. You're trying to legitimate the idea that our current constitutional order is illegitimate, or you're trying to legitimate the idea that the provincial government is derelict in its duty. And so that's uncomfortable ground to be on. And as with the Sorcerer's Apprentice, once you put these wheels in motion, it can be unpredictable where we end up. And just as you say, the vote itself often becomes about something other than the text of the plebiscite or the referendum, whether we're voting on Charlottetown Accord nationally, and it reinterpreted as a vote on Brian Mulroney, or the same thing happening with Gordon Campbell in the HST referendum. Quite often it becomes about the figures involved and generates more heat than light.
I think maybe the closest analogy then might be the 2002 referendums that I think a lot of people forget that Gordon Campbell called right after being elected, which was on treaty issues. And these were questions like private property should not be expropriated for treaty settlements, yes or no? And protected areas should be maintained for the benefit of all British Columbians, yes or no? Just these very binary, unnuanced approaches to things that are complicated. You can't, in some cases, vote on. Like he had in there, Aboriginal self-government should have the characteristics of local government with powers delegated from Canada and British Columbia. And like these questions are beside how Canada actually works and the arrangements within the Constitution. And so there, in that case, there was this big call for a boycott, and 55 to 60,000 votes were rejected of the people who actually submitted them back. The votes that were cast were all like 80% in agreement for all of these, but I think it became an embarrassment for the province, and they just kind of ignored it after. And that's what I would hope happens in Vancouver, is spoil these questions in some way. Don't vote on them.
It's always an option for voters. One risk is that if the voters conclude that this is all smoke and no substance, then they will simply stay home and send a signal that way. But that's a very weak signal. Spoiling your ballot in a vote is a much stronger signal that there's something about this, the nature of the question, the nature of the process that you fundamentally object to. So that's an option. And you're right about those 2002 questions. It was an attempt to try to establish a rock solid bargaining position for the provincial government, as the then new BC Liberals government looking to take over treaty negotiations, or at least the provincial role in those, with Indigenous peoples, and trying to take some issues off the table, which is frankly not theirs to take off. It's not up to the provincial government how self-government is organized, if indeed it is going to be self-government. It's implied in the concept. So there are always going to be unforeseen consequences of staging an exercise like this. And the end result may be to delegitimize ABC if people really start to object to this use of the plebiscite power.
Yeah, and I think that came down in the council debate around this. There was some technical issues. I didn't manage to watch the actual sitting of it, but in the end, unsurprisingly, ABC's majority passed it and pushed it through. But you had the opposition take different approaches. Lucy Maloney of One City vocally voted against it, saying this is a waste of time, while councillors Pete Fry, Sean Orr, and Rebecca Bly left the meeting. It was a virtual meeting, but they walked out in protest virtually. If they had stayed and abstained, as Ken Sim had suggested, it would have been a vote in favor because of Vancouver's weird procedural bylaws that mean abstentions are yeses. So I think they took the only principled stance they could if they didn't want to be voting against this referendum. I think their hands were kind of tied. There wasn't a lot of procedural moves they could do to stop this. And so they made their opposition known, and they put some statements out after and point out what a big waste of money this is all going to be.
Yeah. I will point out that someone like Sean Orr is being put into a difficult position here, given prior history of ABC spreading unfounded rumors effectively about him being a source of hard drugs. Currently, there is a court case dealing with that issue, but clearly ABC is trying to set up the perception that the rest of council is soft on hard drugs, and ABC is the only party that can be trusted to try to deal with the problem of drugs in Vancouver streets. That's the unmistakable structure here. And so I understand these councillors feel like they're being put in an awkward position having to vote against a motion like this, but it is an unfortunate outcome, and to feel like you have no choice but to boycott rather than voting what you actually think is the right answer on a question.
Yeah. Which kind of brings us to where all these parties are sitting. So we have 2 local election polls, which are good effort in trying to poll local elections. We've seen a lot of polls over the years on local elections, and they are hard to do. Turnout is low, response rates are low, name recognition is in the floor, and yet Research Co. and Palace are out there actually trying to figure out what's going to happen in the election. So Research Co. for their part, both pollsters asked the basic, like, how do you feel about Ken Sim and how do you feel about these other candidates? And I don't think we need to go too into that because it's not surprising. Very few people are pretty gung-ho and excited about Ken Sim. For the most part, his approval rating's pretty low. And that's also reflected in the fact that only 22% of people told Research Co. they would vote for him for mayor, and 14% of people told Palace. And notably, the Palace poll was commissioned by the Conservative Electors Association, despite them not having any presence in Vancouver at the moment.
It is always worth keeping in mind who is funding polling into what I think Research Co. for its part engages in this kind of polling to draw attention to the issues, and it's a way to ensure that they're part of the conversation and voters have information to draw on. So I think that's worth noting. The fact that neither poll shows anyone really breaking away, I think, is the thing that you have to take away most. And then we can use the results to help with some sorting between the more competitive candidates, particularly for mayor and some of the also rans, because there's so much noise in this signal between people having a generally good disposition or less good towards a party and actually putting an X beside a particular candidate for a council seat. I don't know that we can fully project where council is going to be, other than this is close and is unpredictable as a result. So we can predict a little unpredictable.
I think the interesting things in both of these, we'll just put links in the show notes so people can go through all the numbers, but Kareem Alam's Vancouver Liberals does pretty well in both, getting around 12 to 14% of the vote, depending on how you ask the question. Ken Sim's still sitting around 20%, which could be enough to win at this point, right? If you take the unsures out, he's at 30%. And that would be quite the result for first past the post to deliver him a re-election with 30%.
First 10 past the post.
Yeah, on council. And among the progressive parties, between the Greens, One City, and Cope, Pete Fry and the Greens are the only ones with momentum. Fry leads all the mayoral questions. The Greens actually lead Palace's council questions. Cope has 11% on the council side of people would vote for them, but Stephanie Allen, their mayoral candidate, is kind of near the bottom of the pack in both questions, as is William Azaroff from One City. Yeah. And One City did not even really factor on the Palace poll. They got 2% of people would vote for them for council.
Yeah, I think we can, again, sorting between those who are currently competitive and those who are in trouble. Cope and One City are having trouble breaking through, and particularly their mayoral candidates. So that's going to, I think, be part of the conversation as those parties continue to dance around their kind of agreement to kind of sort of work together, but also kind of sort of campaign against each other above all. And at some point, the progressive parties in the city really do have to figure out, are they looking at one another as their primary opponents, trying to be the first among the progressive parties, or are they looking at BC? And now they have to look at the Liberals, because the Liberals clearly have broken through. They are going to be there to the finish line in some form. It is increasingly looking like there are three channels here. There is an ABC right of center channel. They've locked up a core demographic. They have strong support in some of the downtown communities in the city and some of the well-to-do parts of the city. That's a strong vote, but it's also capped pretty clearly. Then we have the Liberals having opened up a middle of the road path that previous parties have failed to achieve. Notably, Mark Harrison has tried to do this a couple times before. So this is a new development, this idea that there is room for a middle channel in Vancouver politics. We'll see if it lasts, but it seems to have some kind of carrying capacity. And then we have the progressive parties that are perceived in a kind of group. And Pete Fry is the name that's breaking through there. And I guess if you want to say the fourth name that is still floating around, Colleen Hardwick remains a wild card, drawing to some extent from that right of center constituency, those who are really opposed to any kind of development. But some of that support comes from across the spectrum as well. And Rebecca Bly has been here, but is not really here. And so I think she's the other to put in the category of someone who has to think about how committed they are to this project.
Yeah, I feel like Team is really sitting around where it's been since Colleen Hardwick launched it for 2022, right? She came in third in that election, but it was 16,000 votes to Ken Sim's 85,000 and Kennedy Stewart's 49,000. So it was, on the ballot, but kind of 10%-ish. I don't have the exact percentage in front of me, but I think that's where she's going to end up again. The Liberals have been really fascinating. They just announced John Cooper has joined their team, who was former NPA and was their mayoral candidate at one point. And there's a number of other people like Maurice Stillwell who we've talked about before, and a number of the ex-ABC candidates are now on their park board and council slate between Victoria Young, Brendan Vastyvansky, and Scott Jensen. So for the most part, I think they are skewing to the right. They have a few more people than that, but it's that kind of center right that's not cringe or not embarrassing like Ken Sims' party has become. More serious, right? And sometimes that's what it takes to win. If you can get back that accountability and integrity vote that we talked about off the top, that is a strong path for the Liberals. And it might be just that brand recognition of people going, I like Mark Carney, I'll vote for Karim Alam, even though they're not in the same party, as far as I know. Doesn't mean they're ideological opponents, but just like they're running different machines.
But clearly, this is an attempt, not unlike the BC Conservatives in the 2024 provincial election, of somebody running at a different level of government, trying to tap into energy and brand recognition and comfort at a different level. In that case, the BC Conservatives, despite being newly reinvigorated in provincial politics after about a century, was certainly cashing in and drawing from support from people's comfort with the idea of voting Conservative, given that the federal Conservatives at the time were far comfortably ahead in federal polling. This is now a municipal Liberal party in name, trying to capture some of the same energy that the federal Liberals clearly have. And in Vancouver in particular, Vancouver is a city that clearly looks to the federal Liberal Party in a significant portion of its ridings. And so that strategy is a good one when you can sell it, when you can convince people that, yes, you are really from a similar political background. And Karim Alam, for his part, does have an interesting story where he was part of the conservative world for a long time and eventually walked away from it, saying that these are positions I'm not really comfortable with, seeing the need for inclusive politics as something that should not be negotiable. And it seems that is being reflected in how he's building this party. So people are taking at least a look at it, and we'll have to see how long a look they take.
Yeah, and then it's just a matter of watching the progressive primary try to conclude or actually happen, as each of the parties still has, it's the same problem we've had since the start, where each of the parties has some argument of their own viability. The Greens have the polling, one city's got the money, Cope has, history and volunteers and a decent amount of money as well. But it's clear, I think, that Stephanie Allen is probably not going to be mayor, possibly not even William Azeroff with these numbers. And so they have the willingness to actually look favorably? Maybe you can convince yourself this doesn't matter because, as I mentioned off the top, municipal polling is really hard and is often wrong. I don't know that it's ever 20% wrong, though.
Okay. And by the time you get to a point where the polling is going to be clear enough for you to feel totally comfortable in what it's telling you, the election will have been over for a week. So then it's too late. So again, the members of that progressive movement, not just individual parties, but that progressive movement in Vancouver politics really does have to, those members have to think for themselves, who do they want to see not win the election necessarily, but who are they concerned will win the election? And at some point, voting in a first past the post or a first 10 past the post system becomes about being concerned with who could win, and in a sense voting against candidates as much as voting for candidates, and choosing who your enemies are, I feel like, ultimately. I think there is a real risk here that the three progressive parties are going to be afterthoughts, and the race will really boil down to two very clear and distinct choices, even if they are both in some ways clearly to the right of those progressive parties. So that would not be ideal for voters who would prefer a more progressive option, but the fact is it's a clear choice, and it's a simplified choice. One of ABC's clear advantages in the last election was it was easy to figure out what to do in the ballot voting station. On the ballot, you go and look for ABC, and you mark an X there. It took 5 minutes to figure out a very complex ballot. If you're asking people to go in to cast a ballot and they need to distinguish between 13, 14, however many candidates in the same universe against a backdrop of, who knows, another 50, 80, 100 candidates, these lists get long. Some voters are just going to throw up their hands and look for a much simpler option. And if you have two choices, one's ABC and one's Liberal, it's easy to figure out what those two are, as opposed to doing the much more complicated math of figuring out which of the 3 or 4 candidates from 3 parties do you prefer?
Well, from complicated math to complicated navigational issues, that'll bring us to our Vancouver auto to close off today's episode. And I wanted to take us back to 1970. This one comes to me via Old Vancouver Series on Facebook. I saw a remarkable set of pictures that they posted from this incident. Specifically on August 2nd, 1970, the Queen of Victoria ferry was headed from Swasin to Swartz Bay. It was a fairly new vessel at the time. And a Russian freighter, the Sergei Yesenin, rammed it. It seemed like the Russian freighter had just gotten off course, could not correct, and just drove right through. The ferry was carrying 500 people and 150 vehicles, and a few people died in this incident. But it's just remarkable pictures, and I think they even have a video in this Vancouver's Awesome Photo article that we'll put in the show notes.
It is a tragedy. Apparently, this was the first deaths recorded in a BC ferries incident. Certainly not the first people to pass away in a nautical disaster in BC, but it is a tragedy easy to lose sight of, and a fascinating glimpse into how these things were received at the time. Russia was then as in now, an enemy of the West, and so this took on other overtones as well.
Premier W.A.C. Bennett at the time said, "I am convinced it was not an intentional accident."
There you go.
For Leg and Boot Media, thank you for listening today. Stay tuned for more episodes. I'm Ian Bushfield.
I'm Stewart Prest.
Good day.